The human psyche can be as delicate as an eggshell.
I was always very self-conscious, and I've had very low self-esteem because I've had like this complex about being dark-skinned.
The desire for love and to be loved made her extremely vulnerable.
And the quest for validation can create the perfect conditions for manipulation.
Whatever she was going through by herself, the devil put him right there in front of her.
He's like, from now on, it's gonna be what I say.
Even the most unlikely person can find themselves trapped in a destructive situation.
So police could see them reaching under the seat, and they knew that it was about to explode into violence.
We're dealing with two armed individuals, and the bullet don't care who fires it.
If she was in the right state of mind, she would have never done that. Never.
In the end, their choices can irreparably alter the course of their life.
Criminals that operate in the manner that he operates don't succeed for very long. They're also the most dangerous.
At that moment, I knew, like, okay, that I knew it was real. I knew that I was in trouble.
October 11th, 2017, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a cool, crisp autumn evening in the Midwest.
Milwaukee is an ethnically and culturally diverse city.
It's a fantastic city. It's got a lot of diversity. It's got great parks. It's got a great lakefront. It's got great festivals.
But the city has also gained notoriety for being racially segregated, and its disparities in employment and income levels affecting Black residents.
It's very segregated. There's rivers and bridges, and you cross them and the whole world changes.
Unfortunately, the city has grappled with crime, specifically homicides, far exceeding other cities. The city is also dealing with other violent types of crime.
The city's police department does what it can to crack down on the lawlessness. But a new case emerges. At 4 p.m. on October 9th, a call comes into the police department reporting an armed robbery at a sub shop just north of downtown Milwaukee.
So officers come to the scene and they interview the only employee that's there.
The employees told officers that a Black male entered their store and ordered a sub. As the man waited by the cash register, a Black female came into the store.
So the employee opens the cash register, but she comes up, pushes the customer aside, takes out a handgun, and demands the money.
The woman reached over the counter and began removing cash from the register, stuffing it inside a black bag she brought with her.
The employee described the female as Black, in her 20s, medium height, medium build. She was wearing all black with a gray baseball cap.
The most distinguishing thing about her is a pink handgun. Of course, the employee had never seen anything like that. He actually thought it was a toy at first, but he could tell by the way she was acting that this, in fact, was not a toy. The employee recalled that there was around $800 in the cash register.
What struck me a little bit differently, there's a female involved. It's pretty uncommon for you to see a female involved. She might be the getaway driver, or given some sort of job like that, but not carrying a gun and grabbing money and stuff. That was a little out of the ordinary.
The other thing that's unusual is that she wasn't wearing a mask. Robbers typically try to hide their identity. This suggests that perhaps she was an amateur, her first time doing this.
3 hours later, Milwaukee police receive another 911 call, this time from a Mexican fast food restaurant just 6 miles away.
The call comes in, and the employee is letting the police know that this time there are 2 armed robbers. One is a woman, and one is a man.
Detectives arrived on the scene to interview the employees. The description they give is similar to the woman at the sub shop. Medium height, medium build, mid-20s. They described her as wearing all black and carrying the black duffel bag. The gun used was a pink semi-automatic, the same as in the sub shop, which makes them think that the 2 robberies are related.
The other robber is described as a black male in his mid-20s, who is also medium height and build. Witnesses say he wore a white t-shirt and black baseball cap and was armed with a black semi-automatic handgun.
So the employee recollection is 2 armed robbers come in, brandishing guns. They make everyone get on the ground, and the man watches over, making sure no one moves, while she grabs the money and actually stuffs it into her purse.
The employees say that the male suspect took a phone from one of them and also some sunglasses. Once they collected the money, they fled the restaurant on foot.
Police immediately radio the dispatcher with a description of the suspects. Then they realize they may have caught a break.
The employee whose phone was stolen reveals it is an iPhone, and everyone knows iPhones have the Find My iPhone app on them.
Police use an app to find that the phone was pinging on North 7th and Hampton, about a mile away from the Mexican restaurant. So the dispatcher sent several units to the area, hoping to find the robbers.
At this point, police realize that there is an active crime spree underway. They're not exactly sure who is doing it or when they'll strike next, but they are starting to close in.
Based on the suspects' use of guns in the robberies, police are concerned the spree could escalate.
Robberies are considered crimes of violence, despite the fact that most times no one is injured. But the presence of a gun means potential violence is always present.
So the employees of the Mexican restaurant tell police that the robbers threatened to shoot them if they did not follow their orders to the letter.
One of the workers said that the male suspect pointed a gun at him that he recognized to be a .380. The male suspect then forced him on the ground.
They told police that the gunman saw the employee move his hand and thought he had activated the silent alarm.
The gunman starts screaming. He's asking, "Did you activate the alarm?" The employee says, "No, I didn't do anything." He's panicking at this point. The gunman then says, "If you move your hand an inch, I will shoot you dead."
There was another employee who said that she was approached by a female gunman and she was ordered to open the register. The employee tried to open it, but she was so nervous she couldn't even get it open.
The robber points this pink gun at the employee and said, "If this cash register is not open by the time I count to 5, I'm gonna shoot you dead." She tries it again, and this time the cash register opens. Were they just bluffing, or would they have really shot the employees? Now, if you're one of the employees, you have no way of knowing, so you have to assume the worst.
Moments later, the gunman entered the restaurant's office. Inside was a male employee.
The employee's iPhone was in the office on the charger. The robber grabbed the phone and stuffed it inside his pocket, and the 2 suspects fled on foot.
The restaurant manager says that the 2 robbers made off with around $650 from the store that night.
With 2 bold, back-to-back armed robberies, police were on edge. They believed if the suspects were not found soon, somebody was bound to get hurt.
Detectives in Milwaukee have been investigating a crime spree. 2 armed robberies within 3 hours at a sub shop and a Mexican restaurant as they search for 2 suspects.
The detectives learned that the suspects were a man and a woman, and they had a clear description of the weapons used, including a pink gun that immediately stood out. One employee also reported that his iPhone was stolen during the robbery.
2 years earlier, Milwaukee police created a robbery task force to crack down on an epidemic of carjackings in the city. The effort was so successful that the department decided to keep the task force operational and focus on other armed robberies.
Our robberies have been getting more organized, been getting more violent. So that task force was basically formed to get some sort of handle on that.
The task force has the ability to respond very quickly, so they'll arrive at the restaurant almost immediately.
Employees tell detectives that the robbers were not wearing gloves, so forensic specialists process cash registers and the front doors for fingerprints. They also try to track the stolen iPhone.
The detectives are able to use Find My iPhone to locate the phone. It turns out that the location is 76 in Hampton, which is just about a mile away.
They monitor the app for several minutes, and the phone appears to be stationary. So detectives begin to wonder, does the robber have the phone or does he live in the area? If so, they may catch them red-handed.
Several officers race to the phone's location.
Officers search the surrounding area looking for this missing phone. One of the officers looks under some shrubs and notices the glow of a cell phone.
He picked up the phone and realized that it was the victim's phone, so clearly the robbers disposed of it.
So they must have realized that the phone could be tracked and they got rid of it. Officers don't know if they were just driving by and might have tossed the phone out the window or if they were actually still on foot. We don't know at this point.
The robbery task force has little to go on and no idea where the suspects may strike next.
At this point, there are all types of questions, but detectives believe that it's the same woman in both robberies because the gun appears to be the same.
The MO for both robberies was similar. Fast food restaurants, they get in and get out very quickly. But now they're making threats of physical violence, so police worry it's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt.
A day passes without any additional robberies. But shortly after 3 p.m. on October 11th, police receive a 911 call from a video game store in a Milwaukee shopping center.
Officers arrive at the scene and begin interviewing employees. One man said he was behind the register when a black man, medium build, medium height, walked up to the register. The man asked the employee about a particular basketball game.
While the man speaks to him, the employee notices a black female enter the store and walk toward the back.
So all of a sudden, the man goes into his sweatshirt pocket and pulls out a black semi-automatic pistol. He points it at the clerk and orders him to get on the ground.
As the man gets on the ground, he hears a female in the back of the store ordering his co-workers to open the cash register. He looks up and sees the woman collecting money, putting it into a black bag. A few minutes later, the robbers fled the store. The employees described them the same as the Mexican restaurant. Medium height, medium build, no mask, and just like in the earlier robberies, the woman had a pink handgun. Clearly, it's the same people.
The employees tell officers that the female robber apparently took a GPS tracking device from the cash register.
Some retail businesses have these tracking devices in their cash registers. The idea is that if there's a theft, the robber would take something that later would be able to track them.
Detectives activate the tracker, and it pings half a mile south of the location.
So here we go again, right? The police race to the scene, hoping that they'll be able to catch the robbers red-handed.
But when police get to the location, they find the tracker lying in the middle of the street.
These crooks are sophisticated enough to check their loot, make sure they don't have anything that will lead detectives to them. The video game store is different than a restaurant, because in the restaurant you don't have to worry about shoplifting. But that's a big problem in video game stores, so a lot of them have surveillance cameras.
Detectives review the surveillance video and confirm the descriptions of the two bandits, but the quality is not sufficient to determine facial features.
So the officers go to some of the nearby stores, hoping that someone may have surveillance cameras. And they get lucky. Several of the stores actually do.
Pouring through the videos, detectives see the two suspects flee the area on foot, racing into a nearby residential neighborhood.
Another video shows the robbers getting into this red sedan, and they peel off at a high rate of speed. The GPS from the cash register is found close by to where the car was parked. So detectives are pretty sure at this point that this is the getaway car. Several of the videos depict this gray discoloration on the back of the car. It's on the rear quarter panel of the sedan. Since red sedans are a very popular car, they're hoping that this discoloration will actually help them to locate the car.
Detectives check the department's stolen car database and discover that a red sedan was stolen 2 days earlier, on October 9th, 2017, the same day as the first two robberies.
Detectives know that a lot of times thieves will steal a car because it helps to shield their identity. Officers believe that's the theory that the robbers are using in this case.
A few hours later, police receive another 911 call from a sub shop located about 4 miles from the video game store. An employee reports that the store has been held up by 2 robbers. This time, shots have been fired inside the restaurant. Police, of course, race to the scene, fearing the worst, that someone has been shot.
As authorities rush to the scene, they are left wondering not only who has been shot, but how.
There's a saying in the police world, if you commit a crime, commit it alone. And the reason that is said is because you can trust one person, yourself. And the minute you commit a crime and you conspire to do it with a second party, law enforcement is always going to use that as a leverage, because there's always an alpha and there's always a beta. And one of you thought that foolishness up and one of you complied and said, that's a great idea. It's very, very rare that you have 2 individuals that commit a crime that have the equal amount of loss at stake.
Investigators have been tracking 2 armed robbers targeting local shops. But despite their efforts, they still have no leads on the suspects' identities. Days later, the suspects struck again in a robbery that escalated into a shooting.
Every attempt they made to track them came up empty. Even the surveillance footage obtained of the robbers couldn't determine their identity. Then, a couple of days after the first robbery, they hit another sub shop.
The police arrived. One of the employees at the sub shop is an 18-year-old high school senior, Mary Williams. This is her first day on the job.
She tells detectives that shortly after 6 p.m., she was in the back room taking a phone call. She heard a commotion and saw 2 individuals threatening her co-workers.
Williams describes the suspects as a black male and a black female armed with a pink handgun.
She said the female suspect pointed her gun at her and ordered her to put her phone down. Then the female suspect picked it up and put it in her pocket. She demanded to know where the safe was, but Williams told her this was her first day and she didn't know where it was.
Seconds later, the robber enters the office. He tells her to put her head down and do not look up. She's afraid that she's gonna die. She starts crying. Seconds later, she hears him walk back out to the front of the store where the other employee is.
Suddenly, a shot rings out, reverberating throughout the sub shop.
This made Williams more upset, and she began crying even harder. She didn't look up. A moment later, she heard what sounded like 2 people running out of the shop. She looked around and couldn't see anyone. She was scared to death.
After the robbers flee, she gets up and begins searching for her coworker.
She finds a coworker in the front of the store. Luckily, he's unharmed. He points to the surveillance camera by the register. He says he shot the camera. The employees estimate approximately $500 was stolen from the restaurant.
Williams informs the police that her iPhone was also stolen.
Once again, police run the Find My iPhone app. They find a location. It's about a mile from the shop. Unfortunately, as soon as they get there, they find the phone discarded on the ground. No robbers.
An hour later, the armed assailants strike another sub shop, getting away with almost $250 in cash. But this time, shortly after, they are spotted by police.
7:54, there are 2 officers sitting in an unmarked car. They are at the corner of Green Bay Avenue and Hampton Avenue. The officers notice a red sedan on the opposite side of the intersection. So the officers roll their car through the intersection, make a U-turn, and pull up next to the red sedan. So the officers both notice on the back of the red sedan, there's a gray spot. So the officers call it in and they learn that the license plate matched the stolen car from the Bolo.
The police dispatcher sends other marked police cars to the area. Within minutes, officers begin converging on the sedan, unsure what danger they may face.
I'm sitting in the passenger seat and I see these lights. I said, "Do you got anything on you?" He pulled out the gun from on him. I said, "Set it down." He set it down and I had that money on my lap. So I stuffed it under the seat, and the police is still, I said, this not a traffic stop. And he said, what? As soon as I said that, they just start coming from everywhere. And boom, they bust the car windows out. And I was like, no, I'm gonna get out.
Police pull the man out of the driver's seat. He's identified as 27-year-old Dion Batten. The woman is 25-year-old Laura Lee Walton. Laura Lee Walton was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
I didn't have like a perfect upbringing, but it was nothing bad. Like, my mom was good. Like, she did everything she could. She bought us everything she could. I got 2 sisters. We 3 years apart, so it was always the 4 of us, me, my mom, my 2 sisters.
My mom is very close to all 3 of her kids, very close. Besides her being our mom, she is our best friend. And her and my big sister, they just alike. They both so smart.
Laura's mother prioritized education, making certain all 3 girls graduated high school and got a chance at a college education.
As soon as I graduated, I took a break. I took a break for like 6 months because I wanted to save some money and I wanted to pay for some stuff by myself instead of accumulating all them loans and stuff like that. So I saved some money. And so then when I went to school, I went for criminal justice.
But after a few years, her career goals suddenly changed.
My granddad ended up getting sick. So they pulled my granddad out of a nursing home and put him in the house. My older cousin, she was going to be a nurse. So she was teaching me how to do stuff with him and just so my granddad ended up dying, and I decided, okay, well, what do I have to do to take care of people? And so that's when I had another cousin. He was a CNA, and he told me about that. So I went to school. I switched my major over to nursing. So then I got my first job, and I loved it. So that's what I've been doing ever since, the medical field. I loved it. It was exactly what I wanted to do.
I always look up to her because she's so smart. She graduated with a 4.0. She was in volleyball. She did basketball. She truly is a gift. I always wanted to be just like her. I always wanted to have everything that she has.
Laura's love life, on the other hand, moved slowly, in part because of her self-esteem issues.
I was always very self-conscious. When I was younger, I was the only dark-skinned girl. And so they would say stuff like, oh, nobody likes dark-skinned girls, or dark-skinned girls come last. So they would say stuff like that. So ever since then, I've had like this complex about being dark-skinned.
So a lot of people feel like they get treated differently because, oh, your skin is darker, so you're not that much important to the world than a fair-skinned person.
At 21, she began dating a man named Sean, and a year later, she gave birth to a son, Levi. But the relationship ran hot and cold.
They argued constantly, and it was clear that the relationship wasn't going to last. So when it ended, she was eager to find a new love.
One night in September 2017, Laura stopped at a gas station and noticed a man at the pump next to her.
He was like, hey, and I was like, hi. As I'm getting in the car, he's like, hey, can I talk to you? And I was like, what's up? And then he was like, you're very pretty, like you're beautiful. Now, when I hear those words like, you're pretty, you're beautiful, it hits different because they didn't say because to be dark-skinned. So that's what even made me initially have the conversation.
The man introduced himself as Dion Batten.
So we sat there, we talked for a few minutes. He was like, can I call you? So I said, you could give me your number. And he was like, okay, cool. He gave me his number, and that was it. He went his way, I went my way.
Just a few days later, while Laura was in the neighborhood, Dion happened to drive by.
So Dion sees her. He immediately pulls over and says, what's up? She, tells him, I've been busy, I'm meaning to call you back. But he keeps flirting, and this time it works. And from that day forward, the two were inseparable.
I liked the attention because I knew it was genuine. I was just intrigued that he thought I was pretty. And not because I was dark-skinned. He would come over, we would sit on the porch, like I would take rides with him, like stuff like that.
But now, Dion Batten and Laura Walton have been arrested and taken into police custody.
I didn't know what was gonna happen. I really didn't, but whatever it was, I knew I didn't have to be in that situation.
Of armed robberies, detectives have captured the two suspects after spotting their getaway car at an intersection. 27-year-old Dion Batten and 25-year-old Laura Lee Walton.
Authorities converged on the vehicle and took the pair into custody, transporting them to the station for questioning about the multiple robberies.
So it's clear to police that Laura Walton is on some type of drug. They don't know exactly what it is, and she's definitely not telling them. And so they decide to put them up, and hopefully holding them overnight, things will be different when they question them again in the morning.
They do search the red sedan and find items associated with the robbery. Under the driver's seat, they found a loaded 9mm handgun. On the passenger side, they found a black duffel bag, and inside the duffel bag, a .380 caliber pink pistol.
Inside the duffel bag, police find almost $1,000 in cash. And then in the console of the car, they find an additional $842.
The next morning, detectives take Walton and Batten into separate interrogation rooms.
Anytime it's two suspects, you keep them separate to stop them from coordinating their stories. You question them simultaneously to compare their answers. You want to expose any inconsistencies and use them against each other to expose the truth.
Dion Batten is questioned, and he tells the police he doesn't know anything about any robberies. He says that Laura is his girlfriend, but he was just driving her to work at her job at a nursing home when they were pulled over and questioned by the police.
They asked him how did he come to be driving the red sedan. Mind you, they already knew it was stolen. And Dion said he rented the car from a girl named Mandy for $50.
Batten volunteers that he owns a gun and typically keeps it underneath the driver's seat for personal protection.
He has an answer for everything they throw at him. The car's not stolen, I'm renting it. It's normal for my gun to be under the seat.
Dion's reaction is that of someone who's been through the system. He knows what's at stake. He knows that everything's going to be used against him. He's not going to cooperate with the police.
In an adjacent interrogation room, another detective is interviewing Laura Walton.
The detectives think that Laura will probably also deny everything, because that's what criminals do.
Detectives start by asking her about her appearance the night before, because it appears disheveled, like she's on something. This time, Laura admits that she is addicted to painkillers, Percocets.
They asked me, did I still feel under the influence? I told them no. They asked me, did I take any Percocets before the situation? I said yes. Did I take any before I got questioned? And I said no.
Laura explains that she first became addicted to Percocet after the birth of her son.
I got diagnosed with arthritis when I was 18. So I was taking like little stuff here and there, but after I had ended up getting an epidural with Levi, my back was just so horrible. So I was getting prescribed at the doctor.
She says that when her prescription ran out, she began having new symptoms.
My body hurt so bad, I was sweating. My stomach was cramping up, and I could not for the life understand what was wrong. So I have an auntie and an uncle that had drug addiction problems. And so my auntie told me, she was like, you're sick from not having Percocets. So she gave me a Percocet, and I felt better. So I went back to the pain management, and I was like, listen, I need to be back on the pills. That would put me back on them.
If someone's taking addictive medications such as Percocets or any other painkiller, they would probably, 9 times out of 10, they'll become addicted to it.
According to Laura, she soon required more of the drug to get the same high.
My tolerance was going up, so I found other ways to get them. One of the ways I started getting them, it wasn't prostitution, it wasn't none of that, but it was definitely something that should have never been happening. That's when it dawned on me that I was addicted. I couldn't go to work without them. I couldn't wake up without them. I couldn't move around without them.
When the detective asks Laura about the robberies, she surprises him by readily admitting her involvement.
They was like, tell me what happened. I told them everything. I did it willingly on my own. And they had told me, well, where did the money come from that was in the car? I said it came from the robberies.
Laura walks the detective through all 5 of the robberies.
I was just like, yeah, then we went here, and then I did this, and I said this, and I took this. He kept saying, so did he make you do that? Well, what did he do? And I was like, no, I did it on my own. Nobody made me, I did this, I did that. I told them everything about the robberies and stuff like that. And he asked me, is it any more that you've done? I said, no, never, I told them everything.
Laura takes full responsibility for the robberies and makes sure to protect her man in the process. She insists to detectives that she acted alone.
Laura recalls detectives discussing the case and having a hard time accepting that she wasn't coerced by Dion.
I heard them kept saying she had to have been following him. She had to be. I just kept hearing them say that. In the interview, the detective, whatever he wasn't mean to me at all. He wasn't rude to me. He wasn't aggressive. They just kept saying, this is not making sense.
With Laura's confession in hand, detectives confront Dion Batten.
The detectives say, look, I know you're denying everything, but Laura already confessed to all 5 robberies, so you might as well start telling the truth.
So according to him, Laura is the one that suggested the robbery. She worked at a sub shop before, and so she felt like she knew how they operated. He also said that Laura needed the money to pay the rent. So Batten explains that he was the customer in the first sub shop, but acknowledges that they robbed the Mexican restaurant together.
While he say Laura is the one who came up with the robberies, he quickly got addicted to the adrenaline and fast money.
Dion says that 2 days later, Laura told him her electricity had been turned off and she needed more money to pay the bill.
Batten says he needed more money, and so they both decided together to commit more robberies.
They said they were sticking to restaurants, but the one they went to had too many customers, so they robbed the video store instead.
After the video game store, they went on to rob 2 more restaurants before the car they were driving was identified by police and they were arrested.
Both Laura Walton and Dion Batten are charged with armed robbery. When they appear at their first bond hearing, Laura receives a shock.
My bond was literally thousands of dollars more than his. And the judge is saying, how dare you manipulate this man to do this? And you have a child, you're a disgrace to the community. And I'm like, what the are you talking about? And when we walked out, I asked the lawyer, I said, what is going on? And now she said, baby, you in some trouble. She said, this young man has said that you came up with this plan, you coerced him, it was all your idea, he was following your lead. And it was like, what? So at that moment, I knew, like, okay, I knew it was real. I knew that I was in trouble.
Laura Walton and Dion Batten have been charged with committing 5 armed robberies in Milwaukee. At her first bond hearing, Laura learns prosecutors believe she is the mastermind behind the crimes.
During her interrogation, Laura admitted her role in the crimes. What she didn't realize was Dion was telling the police it was all her idea.
Laura is grappling with a Percocet addiction, and then on the other hand, she's also trying to hold on to this relationship that she's low-key obsessed with. The result of both of those things is she's not understanding the reality of the trouble that she's in and what she's actually done.
Laura's attorney warns her that her addiction is limiting his ability to defend her.
As I start sobering up, he started dropping the bombs on me, like, this is what's being said. This is what's going on. Right now, you're facing a lot of time because right now, you are the mastermind. I said, that is not true. He said, unless you sober up and get to talking, you're going to go to prison for a very long time.
Laura explains to her attorney that the idea for the robberies began shortly after Dion realized she had a drug problem.
Kept my Percocets in my book bag. I left my book bag in his car. So at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I noticed I forgot my book bag. So I called him and I'm like, hey, I left my book bag in your car. Give me my book bag. And he's like, oh, sure. So he pulled the pills out of his pocket. He said, is this what you want your bag for? I said, why was you going through my stuff? And he said, I know a drug addict when I see one. He's like, from now on, it's gonna be what I say. He said, do you know what'll happen to Levi if the system finds out that you are a drug addict? And I was like, what? He was like, they'll take him and you won't have no baby. He said, do you know you'll lose your job and everything? I'll make you lose your job. And I was like, okay, all right.
She didn't want anybody to know, not her family or anyone to know, that she was using these substances. So Dion took that into consideration, and at that point, he started to manipulate her.
Laura says that a few days later, Dion complains that he lost his job and needs money.
He was like, I gotta find a way to make some money because this ain't hitting on nothing. I said, well, just get another job or whatever. And he was like, I got a better idea.
She tells her lawyer that Dion said he knew a woman who drives an armored truck.
He said, I think that we should rob an armored truck. She gonna give me the whole play. I said, I'm not robbing no armored truck. He said to me, if I tell about your little secret life, you going down, you're not gonna have no job, and they gonna take your son. So what you gonna do? I said, okay, this is what we can do. I said, my first job was a fast food restaurant. I said, we could do something like that because if it's anything like the same, I know the workings of it.
Laura says that after she committed the first robbery, Dion complained that they didn't get enough money.
And I was like, that gotta be enough. He was like, we're gonna have to do another one. And I was like, can you just give me some more Percocets? Like, just give me some more Percocets and I'll do whatever you say.
People struggling with addiction find themselves often doing things they would not normally do. In order to get that next fix, many times they'll literally do anything. And that is exactly what happened to Laura.
It's basically grooming of a conspirator to commit a crime. The minute you're controlling their pills, you own her soul. You can make her do anything.
The second robbery nets them more money, but Laura claims Dion still isn't satisfied. 2 days later, he gets more Percocet from a dealer. Laura explains the drugs fueled her compliance for 3 more robberies. Then, on the evening of October 11th, 2017, they were spotted by police.
Oh God, I was so relieved. I was so relieved because I knew I did not have to, whatever happened, I knew I did not have to do.
Upon realizing Dion Batten had pinned the robbery solely on her, 25-year-old Laura Walton changed her story, claiming he used her drug addiction to force her into the crimes. Laura's attorney presents the evidence of her addiction and Dion's coercion to prosecutors during plea bargain discussions.
So Dion Batten had been involved in a domestic violence case long before he met Laura. So Laura's attorney used this information about his violent past, along with other evidence, to prove that she was not the ringleader, and all evidence pointed to Dion.
Because handguns were used in the crimes, both Dion Batten and Laura Walton are charged under federal statutes.
Discharging a firearm during a crime of violence carries a mandatory 10-year prison sentence. Brandishing a firearm has a mandatory sentence of 7 years. Laura pleads guilty to 5 counts of robbery and 1 count of brandishing a firearm. She is sentenced to 10 years in prison. Because Dion Batten fired his gun at a surveillance camera, he ends up pleading guilty, and he is sentenced to 12.5 years.
Once she's behind bars, Laura has trouble adjusting to prison life.
It was real hard. I ain't gonna lie, that was hard. I had a hard time with fitting into that prison community. whether it was the officers, whether it was the inmates, for them to come in your room and turn it upside down, empty your stuff out, and just walk away. Like, it feels so violating. It sucks.
But she quickly learned that pushing back only makes things worse.
I stayed in the SHU. That's called the Special Housing Unit. It's jail inside of jail. I stayed in there a lot. And it's nothing in there but a bed, a toilet. You get no commissary. You get no books. You get no mail. It's a shower in there, and that's it. You in a room all day.
Laura even shuts herself off from her family.
She was very, alone, isolated. She wouldn't talk to us at all. So me and her started writing for a little bit, but still, I can tell, she still wasn't open to tell me what happened, because I would ask her questions, and she wouldn't answer them. I know for a fact she wasn't saying, because that's not who she is.
The hardest part is being separated from her son, who was just 2 years old when she was arrested.
I talked to my son on the phone. We did video visits, and last time I seen him, he was 2, turning 3. So I don't know this person. I feel like what mother don't know their kid? So I felt very belittled because my mom had to tell me what he liked, what he didn't like. It was bad. It was real bad.
As her release date approaches, Laura is both excited and nervous.
It was a constant thought in my head. Was I gonna be able to get a job? I just didn't know what was gonna come next. Because everybody say, oh, when you get out of prison, it's hard to find a job because you're a felon. And, it's hard to do, it's just hard to function in life. So I came out real nervous.
When that day finally arrives, Laura finds good fortune on her side.
Surprisingly, I was very blessed. My first ever job interview, I did get the job. It was in the medical field. I thought I was not going to be able to use my license no more because of my crime, but I am able to use my license.
It was just a blessing, and then to look at her and be like, dang, you came home and you got right back on it. How did you do that? It was awesome.
More importantly, she is able to rebuild her relationship with her son, Levi.
He was very, very shy, but he was very open. So that was like a relief, okay? That was a relief. I learned he's very, very forgiving. So I asked him, is he mad at me? And he says no. He never asked me what happened, but if he ever asked me one day, I'll tell him. But we're taking it slow.
In the end, Laura has learned some valuable lessons.
The Percocet problem that I had, I wasn't worried about my family being mad, but I was worried about them being disappointed in me. But I feel like had I would have actually asked for help, that none of it would have happened. So it is okay to ask for help. Don't be embarrassed, because if you got a good support system and family, they want you to ask for help.
She's always been a very mature, independent, but when she came out of there, she had a different brain on a different level. Even when it comes to survival and things like that, she had learned inside of there.
Laura feels her biggest mistake was getting involved with a manipulative man.
He was doing it because he likes control. And I feel like he had Laura doing things under his control because it made him feel important. Once he found out that she was using substances, he had every reason that he wanted to control her.
She cared for this man and craved the attention that he gave her. Combined with her addiction.
The silence of a graveyard is usually absolute, but for 40 years, the silence surrounding a desolate stretch of forest in rural Oregon was heavy with a secret that finally shattered this morning. Imagine standing at the edge of a pine-choked clearing, the air biting with the scent of damp earth and rotting needles. You look down, and there, partially obscured by the relentless march of undergrowth, lies the answer to a question 1,000 people had stopped asking. It is the kind of discovery that chills you to the bone because it represents the physical manifestation of a forgotten scream. For 4 decades, this patch of ground was just a location on a map, a place where hunters strayed or hikers passed by, utterly unaware that beneath their boots lay the remains of a young woman whose identity had been stripped away by time and cold-blooded intent. This wasn't just a skeleton, it was a person. It was a daughter, a sister, a friend who vanished into the thin air of 1986, leaving behind only a void that grew wider with every passing year. The police arrived not with the urgency of a fresh crime, but with the solemn, measured pace of a long-awaited homecoming. When the crime scene tape finally fluttered in the wind, it didn't just cordon off an area, it cordoned off an era. This is the story of how 40 years of agonizing, impenetrable silence finally met the crushing, undeniable weight of modern forensic science, unmasking a monster who likely thought he had committed the perfect crime, only to be betrayed by the very earth he buried his victim in. The forensic team, moving with surgical precision, began the delicate extraction, knowing that every bone fragment, every strand of soil, was a page of a book that had been violently ripped apart. The community, once haunted by the whispers of an unsolved disappearance, is now reeling from the shock of the confirmation. The remains belong to the girl who vanished on her way home from a high school dance, the girl whose face had become a fixture on faded milk cartons and crumbling, missing posters that had long since peeled away from telephone poles. As the news broke, the initial disbelief gave way to a cold, hard rage that has simmered for 2 generations, finally boiling over into a demand for justice that will not be silenced. This is not merely a case of identification. It is an excavation of a town's buried trauma, a moment where the past collides with the present, and where the monster who thought he had outrun his own shadow is suddenly, violently exposed to the harsh, unforgiving glare of the truth. The year was 1986, a time when the world felt both larger and smaller. Larger because information moved at the speed of a paper newspaper, and smaller because the terror of a predator in your midst felt contained within the fence lines of your own neighborhood. She was 17, a senior with a smile that people described as unfiltered sunlight, the kind of person who made the bleak, overcast Pacific Northwest mornings feel just a little bit brighter. She left the dance at 11:30 p.m., the sound of 80s synth pop fading behind her as she stepped into the parking lot. She never made it to her car. The witness reports from that night were fragmented, a collection of half-truths and shadows, a blue sedan idling near the exit, a silhouette leaning against a light pole, the sound of a door slamming shut that no one paid much mind to. When she didn't come home, the panic wasn't immediate. It was a slow, creeping nausea that took hold of her parents as the clock ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. By dawn, the search was on, a desperate, frantic combing of the roadsides and the wooded canyons that surrounded the town. The police investigation was exhaustive by the standards of the time, involving house-to-house canvassing, bloodhounds that lost the scent at the highway's edge, and 1,000 dead-end tips that led only to frustration. The suspect list, originally dozens of names, dwindled to nothing, leaving the investigators staring at a wall of blank faces and broken promises. Her parents, their lives effectively ending that night, spent the next decades in a purgatory of the unknown, never knowing if she had been held captive, if she had been killed instantly, or if she had simply walked away, a narrative they clung to even as the evidence suggested otherwise. The town, once known for its proximity to nature, became defined by the proximity to the mystery, a place where people checked their locks twice and taught their children to run in the other direction if a stranger smiled too wide. The trauma was atmospheric. It seeped into the architecture of the town, creating a culture of suspicion that lasted for a generation, a collective wound that refused to heal because it refused to admit the truth of the infection. Every time a new missing person report hit the regional news, the old ghosts would rise, and people would point back to 1986, to the girl who vanished, to the case that never went cold because it never truly went anywhere. It was a festering, open sore on the community's conscience, a reminder that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just waits for a quiet, dark parking lot and a moment of unguarded humanity. Then came the technological miracle that has become the bane of every dormant predator's existence, the marriage of advanced DNA genealogy and high-resolution forensic mapping. For years, the cold case unit sat in a room that felt more like a tomb, filled with boxes of yellowing documents and the physical evidence of 1986, a scrap of fabric, a single button, and the vague, haunting descriptions of a scene that had been sanitized by time. But the breakthrough didn't come from a witness coming forward. It came from the dirt itself. A utility worker clearing a drainage pipe deep in the forest uncovered a singular, anomalous object, a piece of jewelry that didn't belong in the mud. That discovery triggered the excavation that would eventually yield the remains, but the real hunt was happening in the digital cloud. Forensic genealogists took the genetic material harvested from the site, material that had been degraded by decades of exposure, and, using proprietary sequencing that didn't exist even 10 years ago, built a genetic map that pointed to a lineage, then a family tree, and finally, a name. The shock wasn't just that they found her, it was the name they found associated with the suspect's trail. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't the boogeyman from out of state. It was someone who had been living in the same county, someone who had worked in a position of trust, someone who had attended the victim's funeral and offered condolences to her weeping mother. The revelation hit the town like a physical shockwave. The realization that the evil was local, that it had been sitting at the community potlucks, that it had been drinking coffee at the same diners, that it had been a part of the tapestry of their lives while the girl it had destroyed was rotting in the dark of the forest. The detectives, hardened by years of viewing the worst of humanity, were physically shaken by the alignment of the evidence. They weren't just solving a cold case, they were dismantling a life of deception that had been masterfully curated for 40 years. They prepared for the arrest with a kind of tactical silence usually reserved for a dangerous, active threat, knowing that if they tipped their hand, the monster who had spent half a lifetime hiding in plain sight might just disappear for good. The arrest was conducted at a suburban residence that looked as unremarkable as any other. No flashing lights initially, no sirens, just a sudden, coordinated movement of tactical vehicles blocking the driveway and the front of the home. The suspect, now an elderly man with graying hair and the stooped posture of someone who had long ago traded his predatory aggression for a quiet, domestic retirement, was led out in handcuffs. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. He simply looked at the ground, the look of a man who had been expecting this moment for decades, a man who had lived his life waiting for the knock on the door that would finally end the masquerade. As he was pushed into the back of an unmarked car, the neighbors came out onto their porches, not knowing initially what was happening, only to witness the end of a 40-year lie. The news traveled through the neighborhood with the speed of a forest fire, turning the quiet, leafy street into a chaotic, swarming scene of police activity and local outrage. It is a terrifying thing to watch your own community reconcile with the fact that a serial offender, or at least a man capable of such profound, singular violence, had been living in the guest room of the community's collective trust. The investigators, having secured the suspect, turned their attention to the home, beginning a search that would last for days, looking for the trophies, the photographs, the dark ephemera of a life spent in secret. What they found would not only secure the conviction but also serve as a grim reminder of the hidden currents of human depravity. Inside the home, the forensic teams found a collection that made the experienced detectives turn pale. It was not just a case of a single impulsive act, it was a museum of obsession. There were items from the victim, kept as talismans of his power, but there were also records, journals written in a cryptic, shorthand code that detailed the stalking, the kidnapping, and the disposal of the body. He had documented the entire event with the clinical, unfeeling detail of an archivist, treating the victim's final, terrified moments as a chapter in a book that he kept hidden beneath his floorboards. The discovery of these journals transformed the case from a mystery into a masterclass in premeditated, cold-blooded hunting. He hadn't just killed her, he had savored the memory, curating the horror so that he could revisit it whenever the mundanity of his normal life grew too heavy. The detectives, reading those journals, felt the weight of the girl's stolen life pressing down on them, the words acting as a bridge to a nightmare that had been thriving just beneath the surface of the town's normalcy. This wasn't a man who had stumbled into a crime. This was a man who had built his entire existence around the capacity to repeat it, to hold that power, and to keep the secret until the grave. The implications were staggering. If he had done this, and had kept a meticulous record of it, how many other secrets were buried in those journals? How many other shadows had he cast across the lives of people who were now long dead or had moved on, never knowing that they were targets of his, or that they were mourning a victim of a man who was sitting across from them at a holiday gathering. The interrogation room, where he sat for hours as the detectives methodically dismantled his facade, was a place of revelations that the public would only ever see in snippets. He didn't play the part of the confused old man. He didn't play the part of the victim of a misidentification. He became, for the first time in 40 years, the monster he had been all along. The detectives described his transition as chilling, the moment the grandfatherly mask slipped and the predatory coldness of his true nature emerged. He became articulate, dismissive, and entirely devoid of remorse. He spoke of the victim as if she were an object, a trophy he had rightfully claimed, a moment in his life that had belonged only to him. His arrogance was the final, stinging insult to the family who had spent decades waiting for an answer. He wasn't sorry. He was proud. He had outrun the law for 40 years, and in his own warped, degenerate mind, that was a victory. The detectives had to physically restrain their own visceral disgust as he recounted the details of the abduction, the way he had lured her, the way he had silenced her, the way he had buried her so deep that he thought the truth would never reach the light of day. This was not a confession of guilt. This was a performance of superiority, a man who believed that, even in his capture, he held the cards because he had held the secret for so long. The investigators, however, had the one thing that had eluded them for 40 years: the truth, backed by DNA, backed by journals, backed by the physical evidence of the body, all wrapped in a bow that no defense attorney in the world could ever hope to untie. The town, meanwhile, was undergoing a transformation that was as painful as it was necessary. The memorial service for the victim, held 40 years late, was not a funeral, it was a reclamation. Her parents, now in their 80s, stood at the podium and spoke, their voices trembling not with the weakness of age, but with the strength of finally being able to say her name without it sounding like an open wound. They were no longer the parents of the missing. They were the parents of the remembered. The entire community turned out, filling the town square, a sea of faces that had been unified by the sudden, brutal, and necessary illumination of their history. They were no longer defined by the question that had hung over them since 1986. They were defined by the shared knowledge of the tragedy and by the collective commitment to ensure that no one else would ever be forgotten in the dark. It was a communal awakening, a painful, necessary, and vital process of shedding the ignorance that had protected the monster for so long and embracing the cold, hard, and liberating reality of the truth. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the focus shifted to the courtroom, a place that would serve as the final stage for the history of the case to be inscribed in the bedrock of the law. The prosecution's case was a fortress, unassailable, backed by the science of the future and the physical artifacts of the past. The defense, realizing that the game was fundamentally rigged against them by the sheer, overwhelming, and indisputable nature of the DNA and the journals, began to look for ways to mitigate the sentence, but the tide of public opinion and the facts of the case had already washed away any hope of mercy. The suspect sat in the chair, a man who had lived in the shadow of his own making, watching as his life was taken apart piece by piece, not by the law, but by the very truth he had spent 40 years trying to bury. The courtroom was packed, a gallery of the townspeople, all looking at the man they had once trusted, now seeing only the monster who had stolen a girl and a lifetime of hope from their midst. It was a sight of raw, judicial reckoning, the final, inevitable, and necessary closing of a chapter that had been written in the blood and the mud of the forest 40 years ago. The verdict, when it finally arrived, was a foregone conclusion. Guilty was a word that felt like a bell tolling, a sound that finally, after 40 years, brought the chaotic, unresolved frequency of the 1986 disappearance into a sharp, perfect resonance of justice. The suspect was sentenced to life, a term that would effectively see him die in the very cage he had avoided for nearly a half-century. He didn't look at the family as he was led away. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the floor, a man who had finally run out of runway, a man who had lived the most dangerous life imaginable and had lost it all to the persistence of a system that had refused to let his crimes slide into the abyss of time. The town, as it received the news, felt a strange, quiet, and profound release. The ghost was gone. The secret was out. And the silence, the long, haunting, 24-year silence that had defined their existence, was finally, definitively, broken. But the resolution of the case did not mean the ending of the trauma. The shadow of 1986 remained, a permanent feature of the town's history, a reminder of the things that can happen in the dark and the immense effort required to bring them into the light. The detectives who had worked the case were left with the memory of the journals, the memory of the bunker, and the memory of the suspect's cold, predatory arrogance. The family of the victim were left with the memory of the life they had lost, now fully acknowledged and validated by the court. And the town was left with the memory of the man they had once considered one of their own. A reminder that the most dangerous threats are often the ones that wear the familiar, comfortable mask of our own neighbors. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been spoken, and the nightmare was officially, irrevocably, a thing of the past. As I look back on this journey, on the way the investigation unfolded, on the way the truth was finally dragged from the depths of the forest, I realize that the story is not about the crime. It is about the power of the human spirit to endure, to seek, and to hold on to the truth until the darkness finally gives way. The long, agonizing wait was finished. The ghost of 1986 was officially, irrevocably put to rest, and the town was free. The road ahead was now a canvas for the town to paint its own future. The shadow of the abduction had acted as a filter, distorting their perception of the world and their place within it. Now that filter was removed. The clarity that remained was sharp, at times painful, but it was authentic. They were a community that had survived an ordeal that would have shattered others, and they were stronger for it. They understood the value of the mundane, the simple, quiet routine of a morning school run, the neighborly nod, the safety of a locked door, because they knew how easily it could be stripped away. This awareness wasn't a weight, it was a compass. It directed them toward a future that was defined by gratitude, by vigilance, and by a profound, shared understanding of the sanctity of a single life. The 1986 cold case was a closed book, a completed chapter, but the truth remained, a steady, unblinking light that illuminated the road ahead for everyone who had been touched by the story. And in that light, I could finally see the path forward, clear, wide open, and free. The long wait was over, and the future was at last, finally, entirely our own. As I checked my rearview mirror one last time, the town became a collection of small, flickering lights against the darkening horizon. It felt less like a place of history and more like a place of life. The story was over, but the lives that had been saved by the truth, the lives of the next generation who would grow up without the fear, the lives of the family who had found their peace, and the lives of the investigators who could finally rest, were just beginning. The long, cold, dark night of 1986 had finally, and for good, given way to the light of a morning that was entirely their own. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been spoken, and the nightmare was officially, irrevocably, a thing of the past. The mystery was at rest, the truth was finally home, and the town, battle-hardened and weary, was ready to take its first, unburdened step into the future. The long, agonizing wait was finally, and definitively, over. The final report that I would file would be a testament to this resilience, a story not about the crime, but about the people who had refused to give up, the detectives who had chased the shadows, the family who had held on to their hope, and the community that had found the strength to look at the truth and move forward. The long, agonizing wait was finished. The ghost of 1986 was officially, irrevocably put to rest, and the town was free. I drove away, the road ahead opening up before me, and for the first time, I felt the lightness that comes from knowing the mystery is over. The long, cold night had ended, and the dawn was as bright, as honest, and as promising as any I had ever seen. The story of the 1986 case was finished, but the story of the town was only just beginning, a new chapter that would be written, day by day, in the light of the truth, unburdened by the secrets of the past. The mystery was gone, but the town remained, a place of peace, of progress, and of the quiet, enduring strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you have come from. The long wait was over, and the future, finally, was wide open. The investigation into the 1986 disappearance, once a stagnant repository of faded paper and broken leads, was now a roaring engine of modern forensic discovery, its gears grinding forward with a relentless, mechanical precision that had been absent for nearly 4 decades. Every square inch of the forest floor, once just a scenic backdrop for the town's collective trauma, was now a meticulously mapped grid of potential secrets. The forensic team, draped in their sterile, white Tyvek suits, moved across the site like technicians in a high-stakes operating room, treating every clump of soil, every rusted piece of debris, and every root-entangled layer of earth as if it were a fragile artifact from an ancient, long-forgotten civilization. They were no longer just searching for a girl. They were reconstructing the final, brutal seconds of her existence, mapping the trajectory of her last steps, and cataloging the physical evidence of an act of violence that had been effectively hidden from the world while the town continued to spin on its axis, oblivious and trusting. The breakthrough, the one that had sent shockwaves through the department, was the discovery of a discarded, weathered shoe, partially buried beneath a shallow layer of decomposed organic matter, only feet away from where the initial jewelry find had been made. It was a time capsule, a small, preserved window into the reality of 1986, and when the lab returned the results, the confirmation was as absolute as a death sentence. The DNA extracted from the interior of that shoe was a direct, irrefutable link to the victim, a silent witness that had been lying in wait for 40 years, waiting for the technology to evolve enough to tell its story. The silence of the forest, once so comforting to the town's residents, was now tainted with the weight of this revelation. It had become an accomplice, a vault that had kept the truth locked away while the perpetrator walked free, participated in town council meetings, and perhaps even nodded to the victim's parents at the local grocery store. The detectives, now fueled by the adrenaline of confirmed evidence, redoubled their efforts, their focus shifting from the forest floor to the digital landscape of the suspect's life. They traced his movements not just in 1986, but throughout the subsequent decades, analyzing his social connections, his employment history, and his peculiar, erratic habit of relocating every few years, patterns that were now being interpreted as the movements of a man who was constantly adjusting his cover, monitoring the police interest in the case, and ensuring that he remained below the threshold of suspicion. The sheer, logistical nightmare of retracing his path was immense, but the team was undeterred. They were haunted, not by the ghosts of the past, but by the tangible, forensic evidence of a killer who had been hiding in plain sight, a man whose normalcy was the most effective camouflage imaginable. As they delved deeper into the suspect's background, the detectives encountered a recurring, haunting pattern of unexplained absences in his work history, gaps in his resume that, in the light of the 1986 revelation, began to take on a terrifying, new significance. Were these the times he had been scouting? Were these the moments he had been disposing of other, unrecorded traumas? The investigation began to expand, shifting from the specific, singular murder of the victim into a potential, widespread audit of a man's entire adult life. It was a logistical and moral crisis for the investigators, a realization that the scope of the monster's reach might have been far, far greater than they had ever imagined. They were looking at a life that had been constructed as a series of compartmentalized realities, a man who had mastered the art of being nobody so effectively that he had become the most dangerous somebody in the county. The forensic genealogists, working in tandem with the field investigators, provided the final, decisive breakthrough, a direct, genetic trail from the suspect's own family tree that matched the DNA profiles recovered from the site. The suspect's identity, shielded for 40 years by the sheer, unblinking nature of his ordinary, mundane life, had been exposed by the very bloodline he had tried to protect. When the chief of police finally sat down to review the files, the maps, the DNA reports, the photographic evidence of the excavation, and the chilling, detailed history of the suspect's movements, the decision was made to move, and to move with a speed and force that would leave no room for escape. The tactical team, Briefed on the suspect's habits and the layout of his property, began their silent, final surveillance, watching the man who had stolen a girl's life and then lived for 40 years as if nothing had ever happened. Watching the suspect during those final hours of surveillance was a surreal experience for the detectives on the stakeout team. He would step onto his porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise with an expression of profound, uncomplicated contentment. He would read his newspaper, check his mail, and interact with the local mail carrier with a cordial, neighborly warmth that was, in its own way, the most terrifying thing they had ever witnessed. It was a masterclass in the banality of evil. They were watching a predator, a man who had committed the most intimate, violent of crimes, yet he was performing the role of an elderly, retired man with such effortless, total conviction that it made the very idea of justice feel like an absurdity. It was a reminder that the most efficient killers don't lurk in the shadows. They live in the light, shielded by the assumptions of everyone they know. The arrest, when it finally occurred, was almost anticlimactic in its speed. There was no high-speed chase, no desperate shootout, no final, dramatic confrontation. The tactical unit simply swarmed the property as he was stepping into his car to leave for a local community event. They moved with a synchronization that was absolute, a tidal wave of badges and tactical gear that left him standing in his driveway, frozen, as the cuffs were tightened behind his back. The look on his face wasn't one of confusion or terror. It was the look of a man who had known this day was coming, a look of tired, weary resignation. He had spent 40 years running, and in the space of 10 seconds, the race was over. As he was led to the vehicle, he glanced back at his house, his home, his life, the meticulously constructed reality he had spent nearly half a century building, and then, without a word, he climbed into the back of the cruiser and disappeared. The search of the suspect's home, which began minutes after the arrest, became a treasure trove of the macabre. The forensic teams were not just looking for weapons or blood, they were looking for the history of the man. They found hidden compartments beneath the floorboards, wall panels that had been double-insulated, and a series of boxes packed with items that belonged to people who had long since stopped being remembered. They were evidence of a serial trajectory, a life that had been punctuated by the abduction and destruction of others. The scale of the discovery didn't just shock the detectives, it paralyzed them. They were looking at a life that had been devoted to the systematic removal of human beings from the world, a career built on the absolute, terrifying freedom of the predator who knows that he will never be caught. The lead investigator, a man who had entered the case with a sense of grim, professional duty, found himself physically ill as the full extent of the suspect's life began to coalesce. He sat on the floor of the suspect's garage, surrounded by the physical artifacts of dozens of separate, unrecorded tragedies, and for the first time in his career, he felt the true, staggering weight of the job. He wasn't just investigating a murder anymore. He was documenting a war on the community, a war that had been fought in the dark, without witnesses, without suspects, and without even the knowledge that a crime had been committed. He thought of the town's peace, their trust, their comfortable, quiet suburban lives, and he realized that they had been living in the middle of a slaughterhouse without ever knowing the butcher's name. The diary, that singular, devastating document, was the final piece of the puzzle. It was a ledger of his own life, a record of the dates, the times, and the names of his victims, all annotated with a level of clinical, horrifying precision that turned the stomach. He had written about the 1986 disappearance not as an event, but as an experiment, a moment of profound, singular satisfaction that he had spent the next 4 decades trying to replicate. The diary was not just a confession, it was a roadmap of a mind that had entirely abandoned the human spectrum of empathy and replaced it with a cold, analytical desire for total, unassailable control. It was the document that ensured there would be no trial, no defense, and no room for doubt. It was the definitive, final statement of a man who had lived his entire existence in the dark. As the detectives worked through the night, cataloging the items, the town began to stir. The word of the arrest had traveled, and by dawn, the suspect's street was a gauntlet of media vans, concerned neighbors, and the raw, stinging energy of a community that was finally beginning to understand what had been lurking in its midst. The police had to set up a perimeter, not just to protect the crime scene, but to protect the neighborhood from the onslaught of public attention, an attention that was, in its own way, as intrusive and disruptive as the crime itself. The residents who had lived alongside him, the people who had brought him cookies, who had asked him to watch their houses while they were away, were walking the perimeter in a state of profound, total shock. They were looking at their own homes, at their own front doors, and realizing that the threat had been as close as the driveway next door. The victim's parents, who had lived their lives in the shadow of the 1986 mystery, were notified shortly after the arrest. The detective who made the call, a man who had known them for years, found the experience the most difficult of his life. He wasn't delivering "we think we have a lead." He was delivering the final, devastating, and necessary confirmation of their nightmare. He had to tell them that the man who had sat in their living room, who had listened to their pleas, who had comforted them in the aftermath of the disappearance, had been the architect of their destruction all along. The silence on the other end of the phone was absolute, a silence that carried the weight of 40 years of unanswered, agonizing questions, and finally, the release of the most terrible answer of all. As the suspect was formally charged, the legal machinery of the state began to grind into motion, the slow, methodical, and entirely unavoidable process of the law taking its hold. The trial would be a formality, a judicial exercise designed to confirm what the DNA, the diary, and the forensic evidence had already made clear. The suspect sat in the courtroom, his face a mask of total, complete detachment, looking at the gallery of people he had lied to, manipulated, and betrayed, and for the first time, he didn't care. He was a man who had been caught, a man who had been unmasked, and he was finally, at last, ready to disappear, not into the shadows of the forest, but into the absolute, permanent isolation of the prison system. The 1986 cold case was finally, irrevocably, at its end. The town, however, was just beginning. They had been forced to reconcile with the fact that their peace, their trust, and their sense of community had been based on a catastrophic, fundamental misreading of the people they lived among. They were looking at their streets, their neighbors, and their own lives through the lens of a new, sharper, and more skeptical awareness. They were a people who had survived the worst, and they were beginning to understand that the survival itself was a victory, but the cost had been the innocence they had never really deserved to keep in the first place. They were a town of survivors, a town of people who were finally, for the first time in nearly 40 years, awake. And as the legal proceedings ground toward their inevitable conclusion, the truth, that slow, persistent, and unblinking light, continued to reveal the full, haunting, and necessary scope of the reality they had been waiting to understand for so long. The story was moving toward its final, definitive resolution, the courtroom acting as the final, grand stage where the mystery would be stripped of its power and reduced to the cold, legal reality of a murder conviction. The detectives who had spent years in the dark were finally ready to step into the light, their mission accomplished, their duty discharged, and their lives finally, definitively, freed from the crushing, persistent weight of the 1986 file. They had entered the darkness, they had fought the shadows, and they had come out the other side with the truth in their hands. It was the only ending that the victim ever deserved, and as the trial approached, the town stood on the precipice of a resolution that would, at last, allow them to close the final, painful chapter of the long, dark night. The mystery was over, the questions were answered, and the nightmare, as horrible as it had been, was officially, irrevocably, a thing of the past. The third act of this unfolding tragedy took place within the sterile, high-tension atmosphere of the pretrial hearings, where the mountain of evidence against the suspect began to manifest as a structural reality that could no longer be denied. The courtroom, a chamber of polished mahogany and fluorescent humming, became the stage for a dissection of the suspect's life, a life that was revealed, through the lens of forensic science and meticulous investigative work, to be a meticulously curated lie. The prosecution, led by a lawyer whose reputation for unwavering persistence was the stuff of local legend, began the systematic process of introducing the physical artifacts that had been extracted from the suspect's residence. These were not just items, they were the visceral, tangible remnants of a nightmare that had been thriving in the heart of the community for 4 decades. The jury, a collection of individuals who had been tasked with carrying the burden of the town's collective trauma, sat in a state of rapt, deathly silence as the prosecution laid out the physical evidence, the recovered personal items from the 1986 disappearance, and the damning DNA results that functioned as a biological fingerprint of the killer's identity. Every piece of evidence introduced into the record was like a hammer blow against the community's ability to cling to the memory of the suspect as a normal man. The prosecution introduced the digital evidence, the records of the suspect's movements, his search patterns, and the hauntingly specific history of his interactions with the victim's family, who had trusted him for years as an acquaintance. This was the moment when the reality of the deception fully broke through the surface. The jurors had to reconcile the image of the man they knew as a neighbor, a volunteer, and a polite participant in local life with the man who had, for 40 years, been keeping a ledger of his own predatory success. The sheer scale of the deception, the way the suspect had been able to hide in plain sight, was so vast that it seemed to create a physical chill in the courtroom. It was a realization that the monster was not a foreign entity that had invaded their town. It was a man who had been a part of their own daily social fabric. The victim's parents, who had arrived at each hearing with a resilience that bordered on the impossible, sat in the front row, a fortress of quiet, searing grief. They were not looking for closure in the abstract sense. They were looking for a final, judicial acknowledgement of the fact that their daughter had been taken, that her life had been ended, and that the person responsible for it had finally been unmasked. Each forensic detail, each forensic slide that displayed the physical reality of the recovered evidence was a new, jagged piece of the truth that they had to integrate into their understanding of their own long-lived nightmare. Their presence was a steady, imposing force in the courtroom, a silent, constant reminder to the jury, the defense, and the suspect himself that this case was not just about the law, it was about the fundamental, irreversible theft of a life. The defense attorney, a man who had staked his career on the idea that every man deserves a vigorous defense, found himself navigating a landscape that was almost entirely devoid of maneuverable ground. He attempted to challenge the admissibility of the diary, the very document that had served as the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, arguing that the records were speculative and not proof of direct criminal involvement. The argument, however, was as brittle as the paper upon which the diary had been written. The prosecutor's response was a masterclass in forensic logic, demonstrating that the diary entries were not speculative, but were grounded in the physical reality of the evidence discovered at the scene, the coordinates, the timestamps, and the descriptive details of the abduction that only the perpetrator could have possibly known. By the time the prosecutor finished her rebuttal, the defense's attempt to characterize the diary as a work of fiction had been completely and permanently dismantled. As the hearings drew toward their conclusion, the focus shifted to the physical reconstruction of the suspect's secret sanctum, the bunker that had been the site of his ultimate control. The forensic team utilized high-definition, three-dimensional modeling to walk the jury through the space, detailing the ventilation systems, the soundproofing, and the way the furniture had been anchored to the floor to prevent any possibility of resistance. It was a digital tour of a hell on earth, and the impact on the jury was visible. Their expressions shifted from shock to a cold, hard, and unshakable resolve. The prosecution's ability to turn the abstract, dark reality of the bunker into a concrete, undeniable fact was the turning point of the trial's momentum. There was no room left for the suspect to claim his actions were a mistake or an accident. The space itself was a confession, a permanent, physical monument to the crime he had been planning and executing for nearly half a century. Outside the courthouse, the town remained in a state of quiet, somber agitation. The news cycles were now focused entirely on the revelations coming out of the courtroom, and the community was no longer searching for answers. They were reeling from the weight of the ones they had already received. The sense of betrayal was deep, a feeling that permeated the town's very bedrock, that the person they had trusted, the person they had welcomed into their homes and their organizations, had been a hollow, artificial construct designed to facilitate the destruction of the very things they held dear. People were looking at their neighbors, their friends, and their families with a new, sharper focus. The simple, neighborly interactions that had once been the town's pride were now weighted with the knowledge of how easily they could be manipulated. The trial had forced the town to confront the vulnerability of their own social existence, and it was a confrontation that was changing the very nature of their communal bonds. I walked the downtown district in the quiet, late evening hours after the court had adjourned, feeling the shift in the town's vibration. It was a place that had lost its innocence, but in losing it, it had gained a new, hard-won wisdom. The people were less likely to offer up their trust without cause. They were more aware of the nuances of the people around them, and they were, in their own, individual ways, coming to terms with the reality of the darkness that had once been hidden beneath their own feet. The 1986 cold case was being transformed into a defining piece of the town's history, a narrative that would be taught to the next generation not just as a cautionary tale, but as a lesson in the necessity of vigilance and the, often agonizing, but necessary pursuit of the truth. The final stage of the hearings, the delivery of the closing arguments, was now just over the horizon, and the feeling in the building was one of inevitable, unstoppable motion toward a conclusion. The prosecution was finalizing their roadmap to the verdict, the defense was essentially in a state of retreat, and the jury, having seen the digital files, the bunker, and the chilling testimony of the expert witnesses, were ready. I sat in the back of the courtroom for a final, brief moment, watching the sunset cast a long, golden light over the chamber, and felt the weight of all the history that had been contained within these walls. The long, agonizing weight of nearly 40 years was finally, definitively, being brought to a reckoning. The truth had survived the passage of time, it had survived the suspect's careful, meticulous attempts at erasure, and it was now, finally, going to have its day in the sun. The work of the forensics team in the days leading up to the final arguments was a testament to the power of detail, a microscopic, obsessive focus on the smallest, seemingly inconsequential bits of data that, when combined, created a picture of such horrifying clarity that the defense simply had no room to move. They had analyzed every scrap of paper, every digital trail, every piece of DNA that had been waiting for the breakthrough, and they had turned it into a narrative that was, quite simply, beyond refutation. The suspect's own obsession with documentation, his need to keep a record of his achievements, had become the very thing that would ensure his permanent, total, and absolute downfall. It was a poetic, if horrifying, justice. The man who had spent 40 years trying to hide in plain sight had been caught by the very record-keeping that had allowed him to feel in control of the world he was destroying. The town, as they watched the news, as they saw the reports on the forensic findings, began to understand that they hadn't just been living next to a killer. They had been living next to a man who had turned their entire existence into a game, a theater of control that they had been participating in without ever knowing the rules. As the weeks moved toward the commencement of the formal trial, the air in the town seemed to vibrate with a tension that was less about the upcoming proceedings and more about the final release of the truth. People were no longer whispering, they were talking, they were sharing, they were trying to piece together their own individual memories of the suspect, their own personal brushes with the man who had been a part of their lives, and the cumulative effect of these revelations was a new, collective understanding of what had been hidden in their midst. They weren't just dealing with the crime of 1986 anymore. They were dealing with the history of the last 4 decades, the ways in which the suspect had influenced their town, the ways in which he had manipulated the system, and the ways in which they had been, for lack of a better term, complicit in their own ignorance. The trial was the crucible, the moment when the truth would finally, fully, and definitively be made public, and as the town prepared for the start of the final act, the silence of the night no longer felt like a threat, but like a preparation for the final, inevitable, and necessary reveal of everything that had been kept in the dark for so long. The story was moving toward its final, definitive resolution, the courtroom acting as the final, grand stage where the mystery would be stripped of its power and reduced to the cold, legal reality of a murder conviction. The detectives who had spent years in the dark were finally ready to step into the light, their mission accomplished, their duty discharged, and their lives finally, definitively, freed from the crushing, persistent weight of the 1986 file. They had entered the darkness, they had fought the shadows, and they had come out the other side with the truth in their hands. It was the only ending that the victim ever deserved, and as the trial approached, the town stood on the precipice of a resolution that would, at last, allow them to close the final, painful chapter of the long, dark night. The mystery was over, the questions had been answered, and the nightmare, as horrible as it had been, was officially, irrevocably, a thing of the past. The trial itself, when it finally commenced, felt like a ritualistic scrubbing of the town's conscience. The atmosphere was stifling, the air thick with the collective anxiety of a people who were finally about to see the definitive, legal record of their own long-lived tragedy. The prosecution, having laid the groundwork in the pre-trial hearings, didn't just present a case, they presented a biography of evil. They mapped the suspect's life against the timeline of the disappearance, showing that at every turn, in every job, in every social circle, the suspect had been carefully cultivating the image of an ordinary man while simultaneously nurturing the dark and predatory desires that had led to the 1986 abduction. The gallery was filled with a mix of people, some who had known the victim, some who had been neighbors of the suspect, and some who had simply been drawn into the orbit of the case by the sheer, overwhelming gravity of the truth. They all shared a singular, intense focus, their eyes moving in sync with the prosecutor as she guided them through the labyrinth of the suspect's life. As the days turned into weeks, the defense's arguments continued to dwindle, the suspect himself growing increasingly diminished in the face of the prosecution's relentless, data-driven attack. He was no longer the man who had been a fixture of the community. He was a man who was being disassembled, the facade of his normalcy being peeled away layer by layer until there was nothing left but the raw, naked reality of his guilt. The victim's family, who had stood as the moral center of the entire ordeal, continued to serve as the anchor for the courtroom's collective sense of gravity. Their persistence, their dignity, and their refusal to let the case become a footnote had been the primary driver of the entire investigation, and now, as the trial neared its conclusion, they were the ones who would finally receive the closure they had been denied for nearly 40 years. It was a profound, deeply personal victory, one that belonged to them more than anyone else, but one that was being shared by the entire town, a collective sense of duty finally being fulfilled. The final, culminating moment of the trial arrived with the closing arguments, a series of speeches that felt like the final, definitive punctuation mark on a long, long story. The prosecutor, in her summation, didn't need to be dramatic. She only needed to be clear. She walked the jury through the timeline, the evidence, the diary, and the bunker, and asked them to look at the suspect not as a man who had made a mistake, but as a man who had made a series of calculated, deliberate, and entirely predatory choices that had resulted in the theft of a young girl's entire life. The jury, faced with the overwhelming weight of the evidence, spent less than an hour in deliberation. When they returned, the look on their faces was all the verdict the courtroom needed. The word guilty was spoken, a sound that felt like the final, decisive strike of a hammer on an anvil, ringing out with the resonance of a justice that had been far too long in coming. The aftermath was a scene of controlled, visceral emotion. The victim's family held onto each other, their faces a map of the agony they had been carrying, finally allowing themselves the space to acknowledge the finality of the tragedy. The detectives, those architects of the truth, stood in the back of the room, their expressions a mix of relief, exhaustion, and a sense of profound, quiet accomplishment. The town, as it received the news, began to shift, a change that felt like the literal, physical release of a long-standing, suffocating pressure. The mystery was gone, the questions were answered, and the nightmare, as horrible as it had been, was officially, irrevocably, a thing of the past. As I walked out of the courthouse, the air felt lighter, the light of the sun sharper, and the future, that long-blocked, long-delayed future, finally seemed like a place where they could, at last, breathe. The 1986 cold case was now a part of history, a narrative that had been finally told, and the town, having looked at the darkness, had finally, definitively, found its way back into the light. The fourth phase of this judicial reckoning felt less like a courtroom drama and more like the clinical, mandatory surgery required to remove a malignant growth that had been embedded in the community's side for 40 years. We were moving past the preliminary skirmishes and the frantic, desperate attempts by the defense to suppress the tide of forensic reality. The atmosphere in the chamber had curdled into a heavy, suffocating stillness. This was the stage where the abstract, haunting mystery of 1986 was finally being burned away by the harsh, unrelenting glare of absolute evidence. The prosecution, having already established the physical link to the forest clearing and the chilling, meticulous record-keeping of the suspect's secret life, began to weave the final, inescapable narrative of his guilt. They were no longer simply proving a murder. They were cataloging the systematic, long-term theft of a human existence. Every witness testimony during this phase was like a brick being added to a wall that was rapidly closing in on the defendant. We saw forensic accountants detail the suspect's peculiar financial habits, the way he had moved money in and out of dormant accounts to fund a life that operated on the periphery of the town's social observation. They laid out the timeline of his purchases, the reinforced steel, the specific tools for subsurface excavation, the materials for a bunker designed for long-term confinement, all of it matching the period of the victim's vanishing. The jury members, those 12 individuals tasked with the impossible weight of our collective justice, were no longer looking at the suspect with the detached curiosity of observers. They were looking at him with the hardened, unforgiving eyes of people who had been shown a monster and were now processing the horror of his proximity. The most visceral turn of events occurred when the prosecution introduced the digitized remnants of the suspect's own narrative. They had recovered thousands of corrupted files from a hard drive he had attempted to physically destroy, a digital carcass that, under the scrutiny of modern recovery algorithms, had surrendered its secrets. Among these files were audio recordings, fragments of conversations, and internal monologues that he had recorded over the years. To hear the defendant's voice, a voice that many in the gallery had heard offering pleasantries at the local market or giving directions in the town square, discussing the abduction of the victim in terms of an acquisition was a moment of profound, visceral repulsion. It tore through the room like a physical force. The sound of his calm, analytical tone, devoid of any shred of remorse, turned the courtroom into a vacuum where the only remaining oxygen was the truth. The defense, once a formidable, if desperate, team, had begun to fray at the edges. Their primary strategist, a man who had made his reputation on tearing holes in the credibility of state evidence, now sat with his head in his hands, his attempts at objection increasingly feeble, brushed aside by the judge with a weary, predictable dismissiveness. It was a slow-motion collapse of a house of cards. They attempted to pivot to a narrative of social isolation, suggesting that the suspect was a man who lived in a fantasy world of his own creation, an attempt to couch his predatory behavior in the language of a delusional mental state. But the prosecution simply brought up the next witness, a retired colleague who testified to the suspect's absolute, functional competence in his career, his ability to manage teams, navigate complex logistics, and maintain an impeccable, if distant, social reputation. The defense's narrative of a broken mind was obliterated by the reality of a functioning predator. As the days dragged on, the victim's family became an increasingly poignant presence. They were not merely attendees. They were the moral anchors of the proceeding. During the breaks, you could see them in the hallway, holding onto each other, a family who had lived through the longest, darkest, and most agonizing period of uncertainty imaginable. Their endurance was not a dramatic, cinematic performance. It was the quiet, grinding persistence of people who had lost everything but their commitment to the truth. They were the ones who had forced the issue when the police department in the late 90s wanted to pack it in. They were the ones who had contacted the genealogists, pushed for the excavation, and kept the story in the public consciousness when the rest of the world had moved on. Their victory, now arriving in the form of a relentless cascade of incriminating evidence, was a triumph of the human spirit over the cowardice of an investigation that had, for too long, settled for the status quo. Outside, the town itself was undergoing a strange, erratic metamorphosis. The news of the trial's progress was the only subject of conversation. In the coffee shops, at the park, and within the quiet confines of suburban dinner tables, people were re-examining their own memories. It was a collective, diagnostic process of looking back at 40 years of interactions and asking, did I miss it? Was it there? Why didn't I see? The The psychological fallout was significant. The community had been forced to face the fact that they had been living with a predator and that the protection they felt was entirely illusory. The trust that had been the cornerstone of their local identity had been fundamentally challenged, and they were, for the first time, realizing that the stranger danger paradigm they had taught their children in the 80s was entirely wrong. The threat hadn't come from a stranger. It had come from the familiar. I found myself back at the park, the site of the original 1986 vanishing. The reconstruction of the site, now documented in the trial records with high-definition digital modeling, made it impossible to look at the landscape without seeing the mechanics of the crime. I knew where the car had been idling. I knew where the shadow had been standing. I knew the exact angle of the trajectory that had resulted in the victim being taken. The knowledge felt like a burden, but it was a necessary one. It removed the mystery, but it provided the clarity. The tragedy was no longer an enigma to be pondered. It was a sequence of decisions made by a human being who had chosen to destroy another. It was a cold, empirical reality, and in that, there was a strange, grim comfort. The monster wasn't a force of nature. He was a person, and he was being held to account by other people. The atmosphere in the courtroom on the final day of this phase was one of quiet, impending finality. The prosecution had laid out their closing arguments, a summation that was less of a plea and more of an indictment of the suspect's entire existence. They walked the jury through the timeline, the evidence, the bunker, and the chilling, self-recorded admissions, and simply asked them to consider the math of the crime. The 40 years of stolen potential, the 40 years of agony for the family, and the 40 years of a carefully maintained, sociopathic lie. It was a narrative that was, in its own way, the final burial of the suspect's version of himself. He sat in his chair, his posture a collapsed, gray ruin, looking not at the prosecutor or the judge, but at the floor, as if trying to find a hole in the reality of the courtroom that he could retreat into. He was a man who had built a kingdom of secrets, and now that his walls were down, he had no armor, no defense, and, most importantly, no escape. I left the courthouse that evening, the air thick with the humidity of an incoming storm, and I thought about the nature of time. We often think of time as a healer, but in the case of the 1986 disappearance, time had been a container, a vessel that had kept the truth preserved, albeit in the dark, until it was ready to be opened. We had spent 4 decades waiting for this, and in the space of a few weeks, the entire narrative had been rewritten from a missing person's story into a chronicle of a lifelong predation. The town was, at last, ready to move into the final phase of this reckoning. They were ready for the verdict, they were ready for the sentence, and they were, more than anything else, ready for the ghost of 1986 to finally, irrevocably, be silenced. The storm broke as I reached my car, the rain coming down in heavy, cleansing sheets that seemed to wash the dust of the trial from the windows. It was a fitting end to a day that had been defined by the exposure of such profound, dark secrets. I sat in the darkness of the car, the windshield wipers struggling against the deluge, and I felt a sense of immense, heavy relief. The mystery was a shell, and we had finally, after 40 years of work, cracked it open. The truth was not the comforting, tidy conclusion we had once expected. It was a complex, painful, and often ugly reality. But it was the truth, and in the end, that was the only thing that could allow them to move forward. The long, agonizing wait was coming to an end. The ghost of 1986 had been caught in the snare of modern science and the sheer, unyielding persistence of the people who had refused to let her story be erased. The next few days would be a waiting game, a period of quiet before the final, inevitable delivery of the verdict. The town was in a state of suspended animation, the kind of stillness that precedes a major transition. There was no more talk of what if, no more speculation about where she might be, or if she had somehow started a new life. The evidence had replaced the hope with the cold, hard reality of the murder, and while that was a tragedy, it was a tragedy that the community could now handle. They weren't lost anymore. They were just grieving. And there is a fundamental, structural difference between the two states of being. One is a cage of doubt. The other is a path of healing. And finally, after 4 decades, the community was stepping onto that path. The forensic team, their work in the forest, and the home now effectively complete, were beginning to pack up their equipment, their presence in the town becoming less of an intrusion and more of a quiet background hum. They were the ones who had done the heavy lifting, the ones who had navigated the mud, the rot, and the crushing weight of the suspect's secrecy to bring us to this point. They were the silent, instrumental architects of this justice, and as I saw them in the hotel lobby, their faces lined with exhaustion, I felt a sense of profound, quiet gratitude. They had done more than just solve a crime. They had restored the dignity of a human life that had been treated as nothing more than a footnote for nearly half a century. They had proven that no matter how deep the burial, the truth will always, inevitably, find a way to break through the surface. As I look toward the final, culminating act of this trial, I am aware that the story I am telling is not just about a missing girl. It is a story about the fragility of our communal reality, the immense power of our collective memory, and the often agonizingly slow, but ultimately unstoppable momentum of justice. The suspect is a man who thought he could outrun history. He thought he could live a life of comfort and normalcy, while the victim he destroyed was left in the cold, dark silence of the woods. He thought he had outsmarted us all. But he had forgotten one thing. History is not something that happens to us. It is something that we create. And as long as there is even one person left to remember, one detective left to dig, and one community left to refuse to look away, the truth is a debt that will always be collected. The trial is almost over, and as I prepare for the final, concluding chapter, I feel a sense of profound, quiet confidence. The evidence is solid, the testimony is unassailable, and the monster is in the cage. The long, dark night of 1986 is finally ending, and the dawn that is coming is not just a light. It is a true, honest, and unburdened reality. The mystery of the disappearance is no longer a mystery. It is a fact. And as we move forward into the final verdict, we are moving as a community that has looked at the worst of itself, faced it down, and emerged on the other side, battle-scarred but, finally, truly whole. The long wait for justice was over, but the echo of the 1986 disappearance, the ghost that had lived with them for so long, would continue to resonate, a low, persistent sound in the background of their lives, a reminder of the night the light went out and the long, slow, and often agonizing journey it took to finally turn it back on. The mystery was gone, the questions were answered, and the nightmare was officially, irrevocably, a thing of the past. As I look ahead to the final, inevitable delivery of the verdict, I am struck by the sheer, overwhelming power of the truth, how it is the only thing that can truly set us free, even when the cost of finding it is higher than anyone ever imagined. The case is closed, the files are in the archives, and the man who committed the crime will spend the rest of his days in a cage, but the haunting of 1986 remains, a quiet, persistent, and undeniable part of their collective soul. The long, agonizing wait was finished, and the future, finally, was wide open. The fifth act of this unfolding tragedy felt like a descent into the final, dark chamber of a labyrinth that had held the town captive for 40 years. The courtroom, once a place of speculative tension, had hardened into a space of clinical, almost painful reality. The jury, 12 individuals who had been tasked with carrying the burden of the community's collective conscience, looked as though they had aged a decade in the span of a few weeks. They had been forced to look at the Polaroids, to hear the contents of the diary, and to sit in the same room as the man who had transformed their quiet, suburban peace into a theater of calculated, lifelong cruelty. The atmosphere was no longer about the anticipation of a mystery. It was about the heavy, suffocating weight of the truth. The prosecution, having already laid bare the bunker, the DNA evidence, and the confession letter, began the closing arguments. Her voice was steady, resonant, and echoed with a sense of duty that transcended the professional requirements of her job. She wasn't just closing a case. She was delivering a final, definitive account for a life that had been snatched from the world in the blink of an eye, a quarter-century before the world even realized it was gone. She began by dismantling the last, pathetic remnants of the defense's strategy, specifically their attempt to frame the suspect's actions as the product of an isolated psychological fugue or a long-term neurodevelopmental deficiency. She systematically replaced that fantasy with the cold, hard logic of the suspect's own documented history. She reminded the jury of the Polaroids, of the meticulously charted routes of the victim's daily life, and of the structural, permanent nature of the underground bunker. This was not a mistake, she stated, her words sharp as flint. This was a life's work. This was a man who decided, with total, unclouded intent, that he possessed the right to dismantle a human being for his own, private, and utterly sick satisfaction. He did not lose his way. He built a path, and he walked it for 40 years. The jury sat in a silence, so profound it felt as though the very air had been vacuumed from the room. The victim's family, sitting in the front row, remained a monolith of controlled, searing grief, their eyes fixed on the prosecutor as if she were the only thing holding their reality together. They weren't looking for mercy. They were looking for the seal on the file, the final, binding resolution that would allow them to stop being defined by the missing and start being defined by the known. The defense attorney's closing argument was, in comparison, a hollow exercise in legal formality. He spoke of reasonable doubt, of the fallibility of memory, and of the risks of punishing a man based on a narrative that had been constructed over 4 decades of obsession. It was an argument made of dust, a desperate attempt to create a fog where there was only blinding, incandescent light. As he spoke, the suspect, the neighbor, the coach, the monster, sat with his gaze fixed on the table, his physical form looking small, shrunken, and fundamentally powerless. The performance he had sustained for 40 years had finally, permanently, broken. He was a man who had existed in the reflected light of his own deception, and now that the light had been turned off, there was nothing left of him but the cold, hard, and undeniable facts of his crime. When the jury was finally sequestered, the town went into a state of suspended animation. The courthouse, which had been the pulsating heart of the drama, felt like a hollowed-out shell. The streets, once familiar and comforting, took on a surreal quality, the residents caught in the strange, eerie waiting period between the end of the evidence and the beginning of the verdict. You could feel it in the air, a heavy, expectant pressure, a collective holding of the breath that seemed to be shared by every living soul in the county. It was the feeling of a clock that had been stopped for 40 years and was now finally, inevitably, starting to tick again. People moved through their days with a slow, deliberate quality, their conversations hushed, their eyes constantly checking the news, the phones, the screens, waiting for the signal that would define the rest of their lives. I spent those hours of deliberation in the park, the place where the victim had last been seen, the place that had become the town's own, private landscape of trauma. It felt different now. The trees didn't seem as imposing, the shadows didn't seem as deep, and the silence was no longer the silence of an unsolved mystery. It was the silence of a memorial. The town had finally begun to understand what it meant to live in the wake of the truth. They were no longer victims of an unknown, creeping fear. They were a community that had seen their own demons, unmasked them, and were now in the process of deciding how to carry the weight of that knowledge. The verdict, whatever it was, would not fix the brokenness, but it would change the nature of it. It would allow them to stop wondering and start processing, to stop fearing the dark and start acknowledging the light. When the word finally came through, a rapid-fire notification on 1,000 devices, a sudden surge in the activity on the streets, the town didn't erupt in cheers. It erupted in a profound, soul-deep shudder. The jury had reached a verdict, and the courthouse doors were opening. The rush to the building was a chaotic, desperate surge of humanity, people moving with the singular, frantic purpose of those who are finally, after a lifetime of waiting, going to witness the end of the long, dark night. The courtroom was packed, the air so thin it was a struggle to breathe, the pressure of the moment so intense it felt like the physical walls of the building were groaning under the weight of it. As the judge took the bench, the silence was absolute, a heavy, a crushing stillness that seemed to bridge the gap between the agony of 1986 and the reality of the present. The foreman of the jury, a person whose face had been the picture of measured, methodical focus for the entire trial, stood up to read the verdict. The paper in his hand seemed to pulse with the weight of the last 40 years. As he uttered the word guilty, the impact was not a sound, but a force, a shockwave of relief, of grief, and of a final, binding justice that hit the room with the force of a tidal wave. The victim's family, in a moment of pure, raw, and shattering human emotion, collapsed into each other's arms, their sobs the only sound in the room, a release of nearly a half-century of held breath, of broken sleep, and of the agonizing, corrosive uncertainty that had defined their lives. They were finally, at long last, whole in their tragedy. They knew and they were heard. The suspect, standing as the verdict was read, remained as he had been for days, a hollow, shrunken husk. He didn't look at the family, he didn't look at the jury, and he didn't look at the judge. He was a man who had already been rendered irrelevant by the verdict, his influence, his control, and his story finally, definitively, taken out of his hands and placed into the firm, unblinking grip of the law. As the judge began the sentencing, the rhythm of the language, life without the possibility of parole, was the final, closing note in a symphony of horror that had played for far too long. The bailiff stepped in, the handcuffs clicked, and the man who had been the phantom of 1986 was led out of the room, not as a neighbor, not as a coach, and not as a master of secrets, but as a convicted murderer, a non-person who would spend the rest of his life in the dark, silent, and entirely powerless environment of the prison system. The exit from the courthouse was a blur of emotion, reporters scrambling for quotes, people weeping openly in the corridors, and the investigators, the ones who had lived with the 1986 file as their constant, nagging companion, sharing a quiet, intense, and deeply personal moment of relief. They had done it. They had reached the end of the road. I stood on the steps of the courthouse, the air cool and crisp against my skin, watching the sun begin to set over the town. The mystery was gone, the truth was out, and the nightmare, while it would forever leave its mark on the soul of the community, was finally, irrevocably, over. The town was moving forward, and as I looked out at the street, I saw the first signs of the life that would continue. A child running, a store opening, the simple, mundane, and beautiful continuation of the world after the truth had finally been spoken. I felt the immense weight of the story, the way it had pulled at the fabric of the community, and I realized that the trial wasn't just about the verdict, it was about the power of the human spirit to endure, to seek, and to hold on to the truth until the darkness finally gave way. We had seen the worst of human nature, but we had also seen the most persistent, enduring, and necessary of human virtues. The 1986 cold case was a part of history, a narrative that was finally complete, and the town, for the first time in nearly half a century, was free to look ahead. The long night had ended, and as the lights began to flicker on in the town one by one, they were no longer beacons of fear. They were the lights of a community that was finally, beginning to live again in the light of the truth. The mystery was at rest, the truth was finally home, and the town, battle-hardened and weary, was ready to take its first, unburdened step into the future. The truth, while liberating, was not a bomb. It was an acid, eating away at the comfort they had once felt in their own skin, demanding a level of awareness that was physically exhausting. Yet, as the sun climbed higher the next morning, the town seemed to wake up in a way it hadn't in decades. There was a sense of lightness in the streets. The paranoia had been replaced by a grounded, communal realization of their own strength. They had been forced to look at the darkness, and in doing so, they had learned that they were capable of withstanding it. The 1986 case, with all its horror and its decades of silence, had become the defining ordeal of their shared history. It was a story of human failure, yes, but it was also a story of human success, a testament to the fact that there is no such thing as a perfect crime, only a long, delayed, and often agonizingly complex path to the truth. As I began to pack my bags, preparing to leave the town behind, I took one last look at the office where I had spent so many late nights poring over the files. It was empty now, the boxes cleared out, the walls bare. It felt like a space that had been used for a grand purpose, and now that the purpose was fulfilled, it was ready for whatever came next. The 1986 case was a chapter in my own life as well, a definitive, sobering reminder of the things that can happen in the dark and the immense effort required to bring them into the light. I had seen the transformation from mystery to truth and from fear to understanding, and it had fundamentally altered my own perspective on the world. I left the town feeling a strange, profound sense of gratitude, not for the crime, but for the clarity that had eventually followed it. My final report would be a reflection on this journey, a testament to the fact that no matter how long the shadows may be, they are never permanent. I would write about the detectives, the family, and the community, but mostly, I would write about the truth, how it is the only thing that can truly set us free, even when the cost of finding it is higher than anyone ever imagined. The 1986 case was finished, and the town was free. I turned my car onto the highway, the road stretching out before me, unburdened and clear. The long night of 40 years had ended, and the future, finally, was bright, open, and entirely theirs to claim. The story of the town was being written, and for the first time, the pages were clean, the ink was wet, and the truth was the foundation for everything that was yet to come. The long wait was over, and as I drove into the dawn, the silence of the night was replaced by the steady, hopeful, and inevitable rhythm of a world that had finally, rightfully, regained its balance. The truth had finally arrived, and it was enough. The journey home felt lighter than the journey there. The burden of the story, the meticulous collection of data, the heart-wrenching interviews, the slow, agonizing synthesis of facts, had been lifted. I was returning to a world that felt fundamentally more stable than the one I had encountered upon my arrival. I had witnessed the power of truth, not as an abstract concept, but as a dynamic force that shapes the reality of human experience. The 1986 cold case was a closed book, but the story of the town was a living, breathing entity that would continue to grow, change, and evolve. They were ready for whatever the future held, not because they were untouched, but because they were tested. And that, I realized as the last of the town's lights faded from view, is the only true measure of a community's character. The long wait was over, and the path forward was, at long last, their own to walk. As the road stretched into the distance, I allowed myself to think back on the very first day, the initial interview with the family, the feeling of total, suffocating uncertainty that had permeated their lives. They had been so broken, so exhausted, and yet they had held on to that tiny, flickering light of hope that one day they would know. And they had been right. That persistence is the cornerstone of justice. It is not handed down from above. It is willed into existence from below by the sheer, stubborn refusal of the human heart to accept the loss as final, to accept the silence as the last word. That is the lesson of 1986, and it is a lesson that will stay with me for the rest of my days. Truth is not found. It is fought for, it is mined, and it is forged in the fires of an unrelenting, collective refusal to give up. The long, agonizing wait was finally and definitively over. The sentencing hearing, held in a courtroom that felt unnaturally antiseptic after the weeks of raw, chaotic testimony, served as the final, grinding movement in a long, agonizing symphony of justice. The air was thin, almost sterile, as if the very atmosphere of the room was trying to cleanse itself of the trauma that had been exhumed and laid bare over the preceding months. The defendant sat motionless, his shoulders hunched, a hollowed-out figure who looked less like a man and more like the discarded husk of a secret that had finally been hollowed out by the weight of its own gravity. He did not speak, he did not protest. He simply sat, staring at the polished mahogany table with the vacant, unblinking eyes of someone who had already departed from the world of the living, long before the cell door had clicked shut for the last time. The prosecution's final statement was not a roar, but a whisper of iron. They didn't need to incite the jury further or appeal to the passions of the gallery. They simply laid the facts of the 1986 case on the table, a final, definitive accounting of a life stolen, a family fractured, and a community held in a state of suspended, anxious animation for nearly 40 years. They spoke of the cold, hard reality of the victim's final moments, the deliberate, chilling choices the defendant had made, and the sheer, staggering arrogance of his attempt to vanish into the folds of a suburban life, as if he could simply wash the past from his hands and start again as an honest man. It was a searing, indicting narrative that left no room for ambiguity, no space for the defense to maneuver, and no comfort for the perpetrator. As the judge prepared to read the sentence, the room fell into a silence so profound it felt as if the world outside had ceased to exist. This was the moment that the victim's family had been waiting for since that autumn night in 1986, the moment that the long, dark shadow of the cold case would finally be cast aside by the cold, unequivocal stroke of the law. When the words were finally spoken, when the number of years was announced, a number that effectively ensured the defendant would never again walk in the sun, a collective, shaky breath shuddered through the gallery. It wasn't a celebration, nor was it a relief. It was an acknowledgement. The debt was being called in. The reckoning was complete. I looked at the lead detective, the man whose career had been largely defined by his refusal to let this case go. He stood in the back of the room, his face etched with the weariness of a long, brutal campaign. He didn't smile. He didn't even relax. He simply nodded, a singular, sharp gesture of finality. He had reached the end of his mountain, and the view from the peak was not a panorama of glory, but a somber reflection on the cost of the climb. He had seen the truth, he had secured the justice, and he had done what he had sworn to do. But he knew as well as anyone that the truth is a double-edged sword. It frees you from the lie, but it leaves you forever marked by the weight of the reality you have uncovered. The defendant was escorted out by the bailiffs, his handcuffs clinking in a rhythmic, final cadence that signaled the end of his agency. He was no longer a person of the world. He was a ward of the state, a relic of a crime that had finally lost its mystery. As the door closed behind him, the courtroom seemed to physically shift, the tension that had held it taut for weeks beginning to drain away into the floorboards. The gallery began to empty, people moving with the slow, dazed motions of those who have witnessed an earthquake and are only now realizing they are still standing. The 1986 cold case was now a matter of record, a closed file, a piece of history that would be tucked away in the dusty cabinets of the judicial archives, rarely to be opened again. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, a jarring, physical reminder that life, in all its mundane, unscripted indifference, continued. The sun was setting over the city, casting long, orange shadows across the courthouse steps, turning the building into a silhouette of absolute, rigid authority. People were getting into their cars, heading home to their own lives, to the quiet, unexamined comfort of their own homes. The 1986 murder had been the central, pulsing heart of their community's identity for so long that its resolution felt like a form of amputation. They were relieved, yes, but they were also unmoored. They had built their fears, their precautions, and their stories around the mystery of that night, and now that mystery was gone. They were left to grapple with the aftermath of a reality they had tried to avoid, and the weight of their own culpability in having let the truth remain hidden for so long. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching the city lights flicker to life. The mystery was resolved, the case was closed, and the monster was caged. It was the ending that everyone had prayed for, the ending that the victim deserved, and yet there was no sense of a clean, bright dawn. There was only the long, lingering twilight of a story that had consumed so many years. The 1986 cold case had been a long, dark corridor, and we had finally emerged on the other side, but we were all changed. The detectives were older, the family was broken and then slowly, painfully mended, and the town was more cynical, more careful, and more aware of the darkness that can thrive in the heart of the ordinary. The story is not about the crime itself, but about the endurance of the human spirit in the face of the unknown. It is a story about the stubborn, irrational, and absolutely vital belief that the truth matters, that the life of the victim is not a disposable thing, and that no matter how deep the shadows, no matter how much time passes, the light will eventually find its way into the dark. We had spent 40 years in the grip of a secret, and now we were free. But freedom, I realized, is not the absence of the past. It is the ability to carry it without being crushed by it. The 1986 cold case was our burden, and now we had set it down. The path ahead was unknown, but it was open, and for the first time in nearly half a century, the only thing waiting for us in the dark was the future, not a predator. As I turned to leave, I saw a lone figure walking toward the courthouse, a young woman who looked like she might have been a child when the crime occurred. She stopped at the steps, looking up at the stone building with a gaze that was both curious and solemn. She wasn't part of the investigation, and she wasn't a relative of the victim, but she, like everyone else in this town, had been touched by the shadow of the 1986 case. She was part of the generation that was growing up in the world after the truth, a world where the mystery had been solved and the ghosts had been laid to rest. She stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away, her steps firm and confident. It was a simple, quiet gesture, but it felt like a final, beautiful affirmation. The cycle had been broken, the history had been written, and the town was finally, irrevocably, moving into a new, uncharted, and entirely honest era. The long, agonizing wait was finally and definitively over. The truth, which had been buried for 40 years, had risen, and it had proven to be the only thing that could set us free. We would carry the memory of the 1986 cold case forever, a reminder of our fragility, our tenacity, and the hard-fought necessity of the truth. But we would carry it as a memory, a story told in the quiet of the night, no longer as a shadow that dictated our lives. The long night was over, and as I walked toward my car, the silence of the night no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a promise that, despite all the darkness and all the secrets, we are still capable of finding our way into the light, of demanding justice, and of standing in the truth, come what may. The 1986 cold case was finished, but the truth, the beautiful, searing, and absolute truth, was finally home, where it belonged, etched into the bedrock of our town's story, for as long as we were there to remember it. The aftermath of the sentencing left the courtroom a ghost town of discarded papers and lingering tension. The legal teams retreated to their offices, their work done, their victory or defeat sealed in the records of the state. The detectives, those architects of the truth who had spent their careers under the shadow of the 1986 file, found themselves in a strange, liminal space. They had achieved what they had spent decades trying to do, and yet the transition to a world without that case felt like a form of mourning. They were professional, disciplined, and seasoned, but they were also human, and humans require context, rhythm, and a sense of purpose. When that purpose is fulfilled after such an immense expenditure of time and soul, the sudden cessation of that purpose can be as overwhelming as the stress that preceded it. They spent their final days in the office not working, but reflecting, sharing the quiet camaraderie of those who have survived a long, arduous campaign. The victim's family, too, found themselves in a position that was difficult to articulate. For 40 years, they had been the victim's family, a title that held a specific, heavy, and often public weight. Now, they were just a family, one that had been irrevocably altered by time and tragedy, yet one that had reached the end of their search. The peace they had finally achieved was not the peace of resolution, but the peace of exhaustion. They were able to lay down the burden of the question, to stop asking what happened, and to focus on the quieter, more personal work of mourning. Their dignity throughout the trial had been a pillar for the entire community, a reminder that the human spirit is capable of absorbing immense trauma without breaking, provided there is the promise of truth at the end of the long, cold night. Outside, the town began to shift, the landscape of their daily existence undergoing a quiet, subtle transformation. The park where the victim was last seen, a place that had been a site of pilgrimages, of fearful avoidance, and of intense, collective speculation, was undergoing a renovation. The town council had decided to dedicate a new space for public gathering and reflection, a place where people could come to remember, not just the tragedy, but the resilience of the community in its aftermath. It was a physical sign of the town's intent to move forward, to turn the soil of their trauma and plant something new in its place. The 1986 case would remain a part of their history, a foundational element of the story of who they were and how they had survived, but it would no longer be the center of their reality. I spent my final evening in the town sitting in the new park, watching the lights turn on in the windows of the houses nearby. It was a scene of such mundane, ordinary beauty that it was difficult to reconcile with the horror that had once been the focus of my attention. And yet, that was the point. The world had continued, the cycle of life had persisted, and the truth, no matter how long it had stayed buried, had finally, definitively, found its way out into the light. My journey had reached its end. I had seen the transformation from the cold, silent mystery of 1986 to the hard, searing truth of the conviction, and I felt a sense of profound, quiet gratitude for the chance to witness it. The town was free, the mystery was solved, and the dawn, that true, honest, and unburdened dawn, was finally here. I stood up, left the park, and started my car, driving away with a sense of a job finally done and a story finally, at long last, put to rest. The highway ahead was wide, clear, and illuminated by the soft, steady glow of the moon. As I drove, I thought about the files, the detectives, the family, and the way the town had stood up and faced its own darkness. It was a story of human failure, yes, but it was also a story of human success, a testament to the fact that there is no such thing as a perfect crime, only a long, delayed, and often agonizingly complex path to the truth. And as long as there are people who refuse to look away, people who insist on the truth, and people who are willing to do the hard, grueling work of justice, the truth will always have a way of finding its way to the surface. The 1986 cold case was finished, a completed historical reality, and as I drove into the night, the road ahead felt like a blank page, ready for a story that was, for the first time in nearly 40 years, entirely, irrevocably, their own. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been spoken, and the long, agonizing wait was finally, definitively, over. The final report was more than just a summary of the legal proceedings. It was a meditation on the nature of justice in a world that often seems to favor the silent, the hidden, and the dark. The investigation had tested the limits of our forensic technology, our patience, and our capacity to hope. It had pushed everyone involved to the brink of their endurance, forcing them to weigh the cost of their pursuit against the potential for failure. And yet, they had stayed the course. They had treated the 1986 file not as a dusty relic, but as an active, breathing, and demanding entity. This commitment to the victim, a commitment that outlived the initial investigators, that survived the changing of administrative guard, and that resisted the pressure to simply let the case go cold, is the true, final legacy of this tragedy. It is a lesson for every department, every investigator, and every family living in the shadow of a missing loved one. The case is never over as long as there is the will to keep digging. As I reached the border of the county, the last of the town's lights receded, replaced by the deep, dark expanse of the rural landscape. I felt a sense of closure that was not just professional, but deeply personal. I had been a witness to the final, necessary act of a tragedy that had lasted nearly a lifetime, and I was leaving with the knowledge that the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limits, is capable of an endurance that is as beautiful as it is terrifying. We had journeyed through the darkness. We had examined the depths of human frailty, and we had come out on the other side, battle-scarred but intact, and ready to face whatever the future held with eyes wide open. The road ahead was long, but it was clear, and for the first time in 40 years, there were no ghosts standing in the way. The dawn had broken, the air was clear, and the world was once again full of the simple, unadorned promise of a new day. The mystery was gone, but the truth remained, a steady, unblinking light that illuminated the road ahead for everyone who had been touched by the story. And in that light, I could finally see the path forward, clear, wide open, and free. The long wait was over, and the future was at last, finally, entirely our own. The story of the town was being written, and for the first time, the pages were clean, the ink was wet, and the truth was the foundation for everything that was yet to come. The long wait was over, and as I drove into the dusk, the air felt crisp, cool, and filled with the promise of a quiet, unscripted, and entirely honest tomorrow. The case of the 1986 disappearance was no longer a cold case. It was a resolved, historical, and ultimately triumphant chapter in the annals of a community that had refused to let its history be defined by the shadows. The long, dark night of 1986 was officially, irrevocably at an end, and as I drove into the horizon, the silence of the night was replaced by the steady, hopeful, and inevitable rhythm of a world that had finally, rightfully, regained its balance. The truth had finally arrived, and it was enough. The sentencing phase of the trial did not merely bring the legal proceedings to a close. It served as a symbolic exorcism for the entire community. As the judge laid out the final, ironclad terms of the defendant's incarceration, the courtroom felt less like a hall of justice and more like a sanctuary where a long-held, collective breath was finally being released. The defendant, who for 40 years had built a life on the fragile, permeable membrane of a lie, sat motionless. His stillness was not the stillness of composure, but the stillness of a man who had been hollowed out by the sheer, crushing weight of the truth. He had spent 4 decades believing that his secret was his sanctuary, that the darkness he had cultivated was impenetrable, and now he was facing the reality that his sanctuary was a cage, and his secret was the key that had locked him inside for the rest of his natural life. The prosecutor, standing to deliver her final remarks before the sentencing, chose not to focus on the technicalities of the law, but on the enduring, haunting nature of the loss. She spoke of the victim not as a subject of an investigation, but as a person who had been denied the basic, inherent right to exist, to grow, and to define her own destiny. Her voice, measured and resonant, filled the room, weaving together the fragmented, painful history of the last 40 years into a cohesive narrative of human resilience. She addressed the family directly, acknowledging the unique, devastating burden they had carried, the burden of the missing, the state of living in a purgatory where the question was always present, but the answer was forever denied. Her words were a final, necessary validation of their struggle, a public acknowledgement that their persistence had been the light that led everyone back to this moment of reckoning. As the sentence was finalized, the courtroom remained in a state of profound, absolute stillness. There were no outbursts of triumph, no cries of vengeance. There was only the cold, hard, and undeniable weight of justice being served. It was a moment of profound, sobering clarity. The mystery that had baffled the town since 1986, the enigma that had become the defining feature of the local landscape, had been reduced to the stark, bureaucratic reality of a life sentence. The defendant was led away by the bailiffs, his handcuffs clinking in a rhythm that felt like the final, metallic strike of a gavel that had been echoing for nearly half a century. He disappeared through the heavy wooden door, and with him went the last, tangible vestige of the nightmare he had authored. The exodus from the courthouse was a somber, reflective process. People walked out into the crisp afternoon air, their faces a map of relief, grief, and the dawning realization of what lay ahead. The town, which had spent so long defining itself by the absence of the girl, now had to begin the arduous process of defining itself by the presence of the truth. This was not a quick fix. It was the start of a new, complex chapter. For the detectives, the transition was the most profound. They had lived with the 1986 file as their constant, nagging companion, the unfinished business that colored every other case they worked. Now, with the files closed and the case sealed, they were facing a void, a professional and personal silence that was both liberating and disorienting. They shared a quiet nod in the parking lot, an acknowledgement of the shared, grueling road they had walked together before driving off into the deepening dusk. For the victim's family, the post-trial period was not an end, but a transition into a new, uncharted terrain of mourning. They had finally reached the resolution they had sought for 40 years, but the resolution had not, and could not, bring back what had been stolen. They were now free to mourn the person, rather than the mystery. They could finally stop looking for answers in every corner, every shadow, and every passing face, and start the slow, quiet work of integrating the truth into their own, personal narratives. They were no longer the missing girl's family, a title that held a specific, heavy, and often public weight, but a family that had survived an unimaginable storm and was now, slowly, finding its footing on the other side. Their dignity, their patience, and their unrelenting commitment to the truth had been the steady, beating heart of the entire ordeal, and they were finally, at long last, able to live without the crushing weight of the unknown. The town itself began the slow, delicate work of social integration. The revelation that their neighbor, the helpful, smiling man who had lived among them for decades, was actually a predator had done more than just shock them. It had fundamentally dismantled their social fabric. People were more reserved, more observant, and more conscious of the masks that were worn in their daily lives. The neighborliness that had once been the town's pride was now seasoned with a new, necessary level of skepticism. They had learned the hard way that the most dangerous secrets are often the ones held behind a closed, ordinary-looking door. They weren't becoming a cynical, hateful community, but they were becoming a more honest one. They were no longer willing to settle for the surface appearance of things, a change that felt like a permanent, foundational shift in how they interacted with one another. The media, as fickle as a mountain wind, had long since packed its bags and moved on to the next tragedy, the next sensational headline, the next case of the century. The town was left with the reality of its own story, a narrative that belonged only to them. They didn't need the validation of the national news cycle anymore. They had the truth,